I woke up one bright Monday morning. The letter was already sitting in my mailbox. There was no warning, no polite note slipped under my door the night before, just an official-looking document from the Greenvale Shores Homeowners Association commanding me to remove my father's sailboat from my own dock. I felt my pulse quicken at the very mention of the HOA. They were notorious in our neighborhood, but I never expected they would come after me so soon. The typed lines stated that my boat clashed with the community's aesthetic vision, and that leaving it there any longer would subject me to daily fines. I stared at the words and wondered, how could a well-maintained sloop violate anyone's sense of beauty? My name is Daniel Olson. I moved to Greenvale Shores 6 months ago, seeking a fresh start and hoping to escape certain ghosts of my past. The community, perched on the edge of a tranquil lake in Oregon, initially felt like the perfect location. The property came with direct waterfront access. It also included a sturdy dock where my father's sailboat, the Wanderer, had finally found a peaceful harbor. I've owned that boat for many years. In fact, I'd spent countless hours sanding, painting, and polishing every wooden inch to preserve my late dad's memory. The HOA's letter, however, made it clear they cared nothing for legacies. The woman behind this letter, ironically enough, was the new president of the HOA, a figure rumored to be ruthless in her enforcement. Her name is Sabrina Candle. Neighbors whispered that she liked to be addressed as Madam President, or else she'd threaten some petty regulation. They also said she had her sights set on turning our community into a pristine, uniform, and over-controlled paradise. That Monday, as I read the letter, I couldn't decide whether to laugh or feel outraged. My father's boat was elegant, it was cherished by my family, and it was certainly not the eyesore she claimed. A few weeks earlier, I had met Sabrina briefly at a neighborhood gathering. Her handshake was cold. Her eyes swept over me as though calculating my net worth, my usefulness, or my vulnerability. I remember her remarking that my father's boat looked old. She added that modern speedboats were more in line with the spirit of Greenvale Shores. At the time, I assumed she was making small talk, but now it all makes sense. She wanted uniformity, modern lines, and a certain wealthy clientele to move in. An old sailboat steeped in sentimental value didn't match that image. I read the letter a second time. The ultimatum was crystal clear: remove the boat within 30 days or incur hefty fines. The threat included the possibility of liens on my property if I refused to comply. My thoughts turned to the Wanderer, rocking gently at the dock behind my house. That vessel was more than just wood and sails. It was the heart of my relationship with my father. It carried my earliest memories of him teaching me how to gauge the direction of the wind, how to respect nature's power and harness it. Losing that boat would feel like losing Dad all over again. I stormed into my living room. I dropped the letter onto the coffee table. My friend and next-door neighbor, Michael Burgess, had come by to return a power drill he'd borrowed last week. He saw my expression. He asked what had gotten under my skin so badly. Without saying a word, I handed him the HOA's notice. He read it, shook his head, and muttered, "They're at it again. Sabrina's the worst we've had in this neighborhood. The previous president wasn't a saint, but at least he listened." Michael explained that Sabrina's new rules had already driven out several long-time residents. She and a small circle of board members seemed interested in acquiring properties at below-market rates, possibly to flip them later to wealthy buyers. It was rumored that her husband, a real estate developer, was eyeing expansions along the lakeshore. To accomplish his plan, they needed control over the best plots, especially any that boasted prime waterfront access. It began to dawn on me that this boat fiasco might be more than just an aesthetic crusade. It could be part of a push to pressure me into selling. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting that very evening. My intention was simple: Ask them politely to clarify their new aesthetic standards. Maybe put an end to this nonsense. That evening, I walked into the community center, a low-slung building near the lake with large glass windows overlooking the water. Rows of chairs faced a long table where the HOA board members sat. Sabrina, with her meticulously styled hair and sharp business suit, was seated in the center. Her posture was upright, reminiscent of an imperious queen expecting total compliance. I took a seat near the front. I could sense the tension from the crowd. People were murmuring. I overheard complaints about new landscaping fees, about yard decorations that had been suddenly banned, and about the rumored expansions by Sabrina's husband. When it was time for open discussion, I raised my hand. Sabrina nodded almost grudgingly. I stood and introduced myself. I spoke in a calm voice, explaining that I had just received a notice threatening fines over my father's sailboat. I asked to see the exact regulation that my boat was violating. She returned my question with a thin smile. Then she scanned a stack of papers. Finally, she held up a page of typed lines, saying, "We have updated guidelines under Section 4.2 of the HOA bylaws, focusing on modernizing our waterfront. Old boats degrade the overall look and reduce potential property values. We want an upscale aesthetic." Her words felt like a slap in the face. I pressed further. "Could you point me to the exact bylaw that states old boats are disallowed? I've lived here 6 months, and I've never seen any official bylaw referencing the age or style of watercraft." She shook her head. "We in the board have discretionary power to determine what is appropriate. That old sailboat of yours is not. We've received multiple complaints from residents." I glanced around at the attendees. Several people avoided my gaze, but I caught Michael's eye and he gave me an encouraging nod. I knew I wasn't alone. I also suspected that these so-called complaints might not even exist. Before I could demand to see evidence, Sabrina moved swiftly to the next topic, ignoring my questions. My face burned with frustration. It was clear she had no interest in engaging. After the meeting, I lingered, hoping to speak with some of the board members. 3 of them quickly fled, but one remained, Linda Patterson, who worked as the association secretary. She gave me a sympathetic look. Then she whispered that she had never seen official amendments to the bylaws that banned older boats. She hinted that Sabrina had begun pushing her own agenda without following the required procedures. My anger deepened. A single individual should not have the right to impose such changes unilaterally. I went home that night. A storm of thoughts raged in my mind. Should I cave? Should I sell my property, especially if Sabrina and her allies intended to keep escalating pressure? But I recalled my father's words on the day he first let me steer the Wanderer. "You hold the rudder, you choose your course, never let anyone else chart your path." That reminder fueled my resolve to stand firm. The next few days brought more letters from the HOA. Each time, the language grew more severe. They threatened daily fines, legal action, and warnings about forced removal of non-compliant objects. I felt cornered, but I also felt determined to push back. One evening, I decided to research Greenvale Shore's original development documents. Buried among the files my realtor had given me when I bought this place, I discovered something peculiar. My property's legal boundary extended a surprising distance along the waterfront. The official records indicated that a narrow strip of land leading to the community marina fell under my private ownership. Apparently, a surveying error from decades ago had never been corrected. I nearly laughed out loud when I realized the implications. The entire neighborhood used that narrow path to reach the collective marina. They organized picnics there, they held boat shows, and even small wedding receptions at that scenic spot. If that strip was indeed mine, I could do as I pleased. In a sense, I could block everyone else's direct land access to the marina, including Sabrina's, but I wondered if taking such a drastic step would cast me as just another bully. I sought out my friend Michael's advice. Over coffee, the next morning, I showed him the documents. He nearly spit out his drink in disbelief. "They never mentioned that at closing?" he asked, scanning the old survey. I shook my head and said that the prior owner never brought it up. Possibly he wasn't even aware. Michael's eyebrows arched as he set the papers aside. "Well, that would be some serious leverage if you decided to use it." I couldn't deny it. The notion of fencing off the marina path was a nuclear option. Yet, the more I thought about it, the more justified it seemed. The HOA had singled me out, threatened me with liens, bullied other residents into submission. If they were going to push me to the edge, perhaps it was time I used every legal tool at my disposal. I decided to consult an attorney named Tiffany Barrett. She specialized in property disputes, and she'd handled several cases involving overreaching HOAs in the region. She reviewed my documents. Then she confirmed that, indeed, I held the legal deed to that shoreline pathway. If I wanted to fence it, the HOA would need a formal easement to cross. Tiffany explained that the association had no official record of an easement. If they'd been using it freely for years, that was their oversight. From a legal standpoint, I had every right to restrict access. I asked her if building a fence would be too extreme. I confessed I didn't want to harm my neighbors, many of whom were kind and had nothing to do with Sabrina's manipulative tactics. Tiffany acknowledged the ethical dilemma, but she also pointed out that HOAs tend to respond only when faced with a clear, undeniable power shift. If the rest of the community sees that you actually control the path, she said, they'll pressure Sabrina to back off. No one wants to lose access to their beloved Marina. You could negotiate with them on your terms. That same afternoon, I received yet another notice from the HOA. This time, they threatened to charge a $1,000 penalty if the sailboat wasn't removed within 2 weeks. Reading that number made my blood boil. They expected me to cave out of financial fear, but I intended to stand strong. I also realized that constructing a fence just before their next community event would force a decisive confrontation. Sabrina was planning a boat parade for prospective investors that weekend, some bigwigs from the city who might fund a new lakeside development. If the marina was suddenly off limits, Sabrina would have to negotiate, or risk humiliating herself in front of important guests. I decided to proceed. The fence was going up. I set my plan in motion. The local hardware store delivered a load of sturdy wooden panels and metal posts. The workers I hired were scheduled to start at dawn on Friday, just 1 day before Sabrina's grand event. In the meantime, I quietly told Michael and a few other trustworthy neighbors what was about to happen. Some were unsure if it was the right thing. Others encouraged me, claiming the HOA's tyranny needed a stern lesson. That Friday morning, the crew arrived at 5 o'clock, the sky still gray and cold. Using the official survey measurements, we staked out the boundary lines. By 6:30, the hammers and drills echoed across the lake, sending a wake-up call to the entire neighborhood. I saw lights flick on in distant houses. I imagined folks peeking through curtains, wondering what on earth was happening. By 7:30, Sabrina's sleek black SUV came careening down the street. She parked with a screech, then she leapt out, looking outraged in her crisp blouse and pencil skirt. "Daniel," she snapped, marching toward me, "stop this at once. You have no right to fence off our marina." I kept my voice steady. "Actually, it's my land. I have a survey that proves it. Your association never secured an easement, so I'm within my rights." She refused to look at the papers I offered. Instead, her eyes darted toward the crew, already installing fence posts along the narrow path. You can't cut off community property like this. Take it up with my lawyer, I replied, or show me the official easement. She sputtered, then threatened to call the police. I shrugged. I'd anticipated that. And indeed, she pulled out her phone, dialed 911, and reported that someone was blocking a public right-of-ways. The authorities arrived about half an hour later. After they inspected my documents, they told Sabrina there was nothing they could do. The land was mine, restricting it was a civil matter, not a criminal one. By mid-morning, curious neighbors had gathered on sidewalks, whispering as the fence panels rose. Some looked anxious, some looked quietly thrilled, especially those who had been strong-armed by the HOA in the past. A few even offered me supportive comments, while others just watched, uncertain how to react. By noon, the fence stood nearly complete, except for one narrow gate left open so the workers could come and go. Sabrina's next move was to summon 2 board members, Clark Willis and Paula James, to the scene. They tried to cajole me, saying this action would devastate the entire community. My heart panged with guilt. I didn't want to hurt the neighbors who used the marina responsibly, but every time I pictured the wanderer being forced out, I remembered how Sabrina had treated me like a nuisance. This was my last resort. It was the only leverage I had. I explained calmly, I'll gladly grant the HOA an easement, but first the board has to rescind the removal order for my sailboat and end these absurd fines. I'm also going to need assurances that you won't abuse your power like this again. Put it in writing, sign it, then I'll unlock that gate. Clark and Paula exchanged a worried glance. It was evident they didn't have the authority to negotiate on the spot. Sabrina, however, was unwilling to budge. She insisted the boat still had to go, calling my father's cherished sloop a relic that devalues our lakefront image. Those words ignited my anger again, but I kept my composure, telling them that if that was their stance, the fence would remain closed. The day wore on. The fence, now fully assembled, loomed as a tangible barrier. Anyone who wanted to reach the marina by foot would have to climb over it or paddle around by boat. Sabrina spent most of the afternoon on the phone, presumably in a panic. The big event, scheduled for the following evening, would feature potential investors who expected a scenic tour of the marina and a boat ride. Without land access, they'd be forced to park their cars far away and either row or swim. The optics would be disastrous for her ambition. I remember walking to my dock around 4 o'clock. I placed a hand on the Wanderer's hull. Dad had built that teak railing himself. My memories came flooding back. The calm afternoons on the water, the quiet chats we shared about life. My father died 3 years ago. I sometimes wondered if I was living up to his example. Now I felt a pang of guilt, worried that maybe I was going too far. Then I heard a scraping sound behind me. I turned and saw Michael approaching with a sympathetic smile. He told me that word on the street suggested Sabrina had overstepped her authority many times before. She wanted to buy out certain homes, flip them for profit, and push undesirable elements away. Anyone with an older boat or an unconventional yard was a target. My fence stunt might actually unite the quieter neighbors who had thus far been afraid to voice complaints. They might see this as a rallying point, a chance to stand up to intimidation. The following morning, a Saturday, I woke early. The entire neighborhood buzzed with talk about the evening's event. I half expected Sabrina to attempt ripping down the fence in the dead of night, but it was still firmly in place. Michael texted me around 9, saying that Sabrina was running around like a woman possessed, trying to figure out a workaround. Some rumored she had tried to contact the county commissioner, who told her the dispute was private. Others said she was offering hush money to any neighbor who would sign a complaint about me. None of it seemed to work. At 3 in the afternoon, a row of expensive cars started arriving, BMWs, Mercedes, and even a high-end Jaguar. The out-of-town guests Sabrina had invited were dressed in suits and elegant dresses. Several of them walked down the street toward the Marina, only to encounter my fence. Confusion spread as they realized they couldn't simply stroll down to the dock. A few attempted to call Sabrina, others just stood there with perplexed expressions. Not long afterward, Sabrina arrived, flanked by two men in suits. One was her husband, Russell Kendall, a real estate developer rumored to have deep pockets and deeper political connections. She glared at the fence, then marched up to my driveway with Russell trailing behind. "Daniel," she said curtly, "please open this gate. We have an important function for our community tonight." I stood behind the wooden barrier, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "Sabrina, I told you my conditions. Reverse the punitive notices against the Wanderer, sign a written agreement to stop selectively enforcing non-existent rules, and I'll consider unlocking this gate." Her husband stepped forward, smoothing the lapels of his expensive blazer. "This is childish," he declared. "You're blocking a community amenity for petty reasons. We can easily bring legal action for damages." I raised an eyebrow, meeting his gaze. "Feel free. But if you think a judge will side with you after you've threatened residents, bypassed bylaws, and tried to strong-arm me into removing a boat I legally own on my own dock, then you're free to proceed." Sabrina's face paled. She likely realized how embarrassing it would be to drag out a lawsuit that might expose all her questionable tactics. Meanwhile, her guests were getting antsy, many of them checking their phones or talking in hushed voices. Time was slipping away. The sunset boat ride she had planned seemed less likely by the minute. She tried a different approach. "Let's discuss this privately. We can come to an understanding if you just open the gate for today. I promise we'll revisit the matter next week." I wasn't falling for that. Her track record of broken promises spoke volumes. "No," I replied calmly. "We settle it now, in writing, or the fence stays closed." She exchanged a frustrated look with Russell, who then moved away to take a phone call. The tension built as minute after minute passed, the event overshadowed by the drama at my fence line. At last, Sabrina let out a sharp breath and motioned for Linda Patterson to join us. Linda arrived, carrying a folder of association documents. Together they drafted a short contract acknowledging that the Wanderer was fully compliant, that all fines related to its presence were cancelled, and that any future changes to the bylaws had to be voted on according to proper procedure. Linda gave me a pen through a gap in the fence. "I prepared these statements to protect you. Once signed, the board can't harass you further over your boat, nor can they impose fines for imaginary reasons." She cast a quick glance at Sabrina, who was fuming quietly. I read through the pages carefully, verifying that the language covered my main concerns. Then I nodded, pulling the pen's cap off. "I'll sign if Sabrina signs, as HOA president, and Russell co-signs as a witness. Also, I want a standard easement agreement for the association to use my strip of land, subject to annual renewal." Sabrina looked as if I'd asked her to swallow a hornet. But she realized she had no choice. Her investors were standing around, beginning to suspect something was amiss. She and Russell both scrawled their signatures. Linda notarized the document, and I added my own name. With that, I slowly swung the newly attached gate open. Her guests, witnessing the spectacle, seemed both confused and entertained. They carefully filed through, their expensive shoes crunching on the gravel. I stepped aside, letting them head to the marina. Sabrina rushed to greet them, trying to salvage her event with forced smiles. I stood there, feeling both triumphant and drained. I didn't attend the boat parade. I heard later it was a subdued affair. overshadowed by whispered questions about why they'd been locked out. Sabrina tried to spin the story as a minor misunderstanding with a neighbor, but, from what I gathered, the guests picked up on the tension. Some even privately asked me if they should invest in a place where an HOA president was embroiled in property disputes. The following week, I decided to host a small gathering for the neighbors who had been supportive. It wasn't a lavish event, just a simple barbecue at my waterfront. The gate was open, the fence remained, but I'd placed a handmade wooden sign stating, "Private property, residents welcome with respect." People smiled when they read it. They knew exactly who that message was aimed at. During the barbecue, Linda approached me. She looked happier, less burdened by secrecy. She said many homeowners were tired of Sabrina's style of leadership. There was talk of a special vote to replace her. "She's been lying about official regulations," Linda explained. "And if we audit the HOA's finances, we might find discrepancies. She's rumored to have used association funds to pay for improvements that only benefit her husband's development projects." I felt a sense of relief that the community was awakening to the problem. For too long, Sabrina had coerced people into silence. Now, though, they saw that standing up to her was possible. Michael chimed in, telling us about an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Green, who had been fined repeatedly for having a small vegetable garden. She wasn't alone. Other residents had also endured harassment. My fence incident seemed to spark something in them, a collective realization that the HOA was a tool and that it didn't have to be wielded against them unfairly. A couple of days later, I received a phone call from a man named Brian Hawkins. He introduced himself as a reporter for a local news site. He'd heard a rumor that someone had fenced off a community marina path because of an unfair HOA demand. He asked if he could interview me. Normally, I prefer to keep my life private, but I realized that shining a light on this story might protect me and others from further retaliation. I agreed. We met at a coffee shop not far from Greenvale Shores. Brian's questions were thorough. I explained how I discovered the property boundary issue, the repeated letters, the threat to remove my father's boat, and the ultimate resolution. I tried not to sensationalize, but I was honest about Sabrina's tactics. I also mentioned the rumor that her husband was scheming to buy properties at discounted prices. Brian seemed intrigued. He asked if there were more residents who could corroborate. I gave him the names of a few neighbors, though I warned him to keep certain details anonymous for their safety. The article ran online a week after that. Its headline read, "Local man fences off HOA Marina to protect family legacy. Shines light on questionable practices." The piece made waves in our community. Sabrina fumed. She fired off an email to the HOA mailing list, calling the story biased and untrue. But Linda responded by publicly sharing documents that validated much of the reporter's claims. The result was a flurry of emails among homeowners demanding an emergency meeting. Sabrina tried to cancel it, but the bylaws mandated that if enough members requested a special session, it had to be scheduled. That session took place on a Monday evening in the same community center where my troubles began. The turnout was massive. People stood against the walls, murmuring with tension and anticipation. I arrived with Tiffany, my attorney, at my side for moral support. Sabrina opened the meeting with stiff formality, but the energy in the room was too charged for her to control. Neighbors stepped forward, one by one, telling stories of petty fines, selective enforcement, and intimidation. Mrs. Green spoke about how she was forced to pay $200.00 fines because her tomato plants clashed with the landscape guidelines. Another resident described being threatened with a lawsuit for parking a camper on his own driveway temporarily. Everyone demanded an explanation. Sabrina tried to defend her decisions, claiming these were necessary steps to uphold property values. Then an elderly gentleman named Harold Timmons rose. He had once been on the original HOA board 30 years earlier. He held up a binder of historical records, pointing out how the association was originally formed to maintain roads and common areas, not to micromanage personal property or push out longtime residents. "We never meant for the HOA to become a monster that devours people's freedom," he said, voice trembling with age but also with passion. At that point, Linda Patterson stood up and announced that she had quietly initiated an audit of the HOA finances over the previous 3 months. She discovered questionable payments directed to a firm linked to Sabrina's husband, Russell. The money was marked as community enhancements, but there were no corresponding projects that actually benefited the wider membership. The room buzzed with shock. Sabrina's face flamed with anger. She accused Linda of stealing documents. Linda replied that she had every right to access the accounting records as the board's secretary. A motion was raised for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA president. The bylaws required at least 60% of the homeowners present to agree. Hands shot up all around, and in a matter of minutes Sabrina realized her position was untenable. She tried to storm out. Russell attempted to follow, but the crowd demanded they listen to the final tally. When the count finished, more than 70% had voted to remove her. The board then scheduled an official recall election for the next month, ensuring a legitimate process. Sabrina left in a huff, slamming the door behind her. Russell shot me a hateful look, muttering that this wasn't over, but I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Not out of vengeance, but out of hope that the association might return to its intended purpose, serving the community rather than dictating its every move. In the weeks that followed, momentum built for a more transparent HOA. Neighbors started sharing resources on how to rewrite certain bylaws to prevent another single leader from seizing too much power. Linda rallied the residents to discuss everything from honest budgeting to how to handle real aesthetic concerns without punishing individuals unnecessarily. My fence, though still there, became a symbol of defiance against tyranny. I decided to open the gate daily, allowing people to reach the marina as they always had, but ensuring that the association recognized the path remained my private property. A few neighbors approached me to apologize if they had been cold before. They admitted that they feared Sabrina's wrath. One mother, a nurse named Rebecca, confided that Sabrina threatened her with fines for leaving her trash bin out overnight after a long shift. That sort of oppressive environment was exactly why I had fought back. My father's sailboat remained at my dock as beloved as ever. I spent hours restoring the interior wood to a warm shine. One evening, I took the boat out on the lake with Michael and Linda, gliding across the water's surface under a sunset sky. The breeze carried hints of pine from the shoreline. For a moment, I closed my eyes, remembering Dad's calm instructions. His patient smile as I learned to tack. I hoped he would be proud of me for standing my ground. At the recall election, Sabrina tried to run again, claiming she was misunderstood, but the community had learned too much about her methods and connections. She lost decisively to an older gentleman named Richard Carter, who promised to restore fairness and transparency. Her final days in Greenvale Shores were marked by bitterness and isolation. Russell's development plans seemed to stall, and I heard rumors they eventually sold their home and moved elsewhere. The day Sabrina's moving van pulled away, a small group of neighbors gathered on the street, watching quietly. No one cheered. It felt more like a sigh of collective relief. Greenvale Shores was on the path to rebuilding trust, forging a sense of unity it had lost. I retreated to my dock, leaning against the wanderer and letting the warm rays of the sun wash over me. It felt good not to be at war with the place I called home. In the following months, The new HOA leadership sent out a formal apology for the stress the old administration caused. They also passed an amendment. From then on, any change in community guidelines required a thorough review and open comment period. That meant no more unilateral bans on vintage boats. I was grateful, though I remained cautious. The best way to maintain accountability was to stay involved. One warm Saturday, I invited neighbors to a potluck barbecue near the Marina. This time there was no tension or fences to keep anyone out. The gate was wide open, though the private property sign remained just to remind folks of the boundary. We shared food, drinks, and laughter. A few older residents reminisced about the early days of Greenvale Shores, how simple and neighborly it used to be. They thanked me for taking a stand, even though it rattled everyone at first. At that gathering, a local environmental volunteer named Clara introduced herself to me. She mentioned that the lake had unique wetlands on its far side, providing habitat to various birds and fish. She wondered if I'd be interested in joining a team to protect that ecosystem. I realized that the boat fiasco had overshadowed these bigger environmental concerns. Sabrina's focus on profitable real estate ventures had left the local environment at risk. Eager to help preserve what made our lake special, I signed up. A week later, I found myself canoeing around the outer shoreline with Clara, collecting water samples and checking for invasive plants. We talked about how an HOA could actually do good by raising awareness of conservation projects or organizing communal cleanups. If the association was guided by people like Linda or the newly elected Richard Carter, perhaps future developments would respect both nature and residents' needs. It felt heartening to see a path forward that included balanced growth, not exploitation. In the meantime, life settled into a calmer rhythm. I resumed my job as a freelance software developer, working from my home office and occasionally stepping out onto the dock to stretch or catch a breath of fresh air. The boat bobbed softly in the water, reminding me how far I'd come since that first ominous letter. It wasn't lost on me that I'd used a very aggressive tactic to make my point, and though I sometimes felt guilty for inconveniencing people, it proved the only effective way to stand up against tyranny. One afternoon, as I was closing my laptop, a knock came at the door. I opened it to see a middle-aged man in casual clothes, an apologetic smile on his face. He introduced himself as Mark Dawkins, a longtime resident who'd kept a low profile during the entire dispute. He admitted that he'd once complained about my sailboat at Sabrina's urging, though he never actually disliked it. She had cornered him at a meeting and pressured him to sign a form stating my boat was clutter. He apologized for his role. I saw genuine remorse in his eyes. I reached out and shook his hand, telling him it took courage to speak honestly. This encounter reinforced what I'd suspected all along. Sabrina's regime thrived on intimidation and half-truths. Freed from her influence, folks were finally able to say what they really felt. As the seasons changed, the fence along the path remained, its cedar posts weathering to a gentle gray. However, I chose to keep that gate unlocked unless there was some reason to close it. An official easement agreement was being drawn up by Linda and other board members to guarantee community access without infringing on my property rights. Meanwhile, the updated bylaws included a clause preventing the HOA from issuing major fines without a formal hearing. None of these changes would have happened if I'd meekly removed my father's boat. I shared the entire ordeal with Tiffany, my attorney, and she said my situation had become something of a legend among her colleagues who specialized in HOA battles. She asked if she could reference my case as an example of how an individual can use property rights to push back. I agreed, provided personal details stayed private. She believed many homeowners across the country faced similar oppression from overzealous associations. My story might encourage them to stand up for their legitimate rights too. One quiet evening, after the sun dipped low behind the pines, I found myself out on the lake, guiding the wanderer with a gentle hand on the tiller. The water was still. The sky was streaked with orange and purple. I thought about Dad, recalling how he taught me to catch the wind just right. I could almost hear his voice urging me to remain steady, to trust my own judgment when adversity arose. In that serene moment, I felt a profound sense of closure. My father's legacy was safe, my community was on the mend, and I had forged connections that felt more meaningful than before. Sometimes people ask me if I regret what I did, if blocking the Marina path was too drastic. My answer is always the same. I didn't start this fight, but I sure as hell intended to finish it on my terms. Sabrina forced my hand. She tried to undermine everything I held dear, from my father's memory to my basic property rights. When reason failed, I resorted to the one thing that demanded her attention: a fence. If not for that act, the bullying might have continued indefinitely, and more innocent neighbors would have suffered. In the aftermath, our new HOA board made sweeping reforms. They introduced committees to gather neighborhood input, ensuring that no single individual could hijack the agenda. The atmosphere shifted from fear to cooperation. People began planting vegetable gardens again, unafraid of random citations. Residents organized social events that welcomed everyone, not just a curated few. Even the local environment saw a benefit. Folks began volunteering for lake cleanups, spurred by a genuine sense of ownership and pride in our shared space. As for Sabrina, she faded into the background of my life. I heard that her final property sale in Greenvale Shores didn't net the profit she or Russell anticipated, but they were forced to accept an offer to move on. Occasionally, rumors surface that she's pulled the same controlling stunts in some other county, but I've never bothered to verify. She's part of my past now. She represents a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting unchecked authority run rampant. The best part of all is that I get to keep the wanderer exactly where it belongs. Every morning when I look out my kitchen window, I see that graceful mast rising against the horizon. It reminds me of Dad, and reminds me of a triumph that was never really about just a boat. It was about standing up for what's right. The sense of peace I feel now far outweighs any turbulence I endured. Last Saturday, I took a group of neighbors' kids on a short sailing lesson. Their parents stood on my dock, snapping photos and laughing as the young ones squealed with delight whenever a wave rocked the hull. The children learned how to raise the sails, how to read the gusts, and they giggled whenever the boat tilted at a sharper angle. More than once, I glanced up at the sky, thinking how Dad would have loved to see me passing on the tradition. I realized that the fence, while initially built to keep people out, ended up bringing our community together. It forced everyone to confront hidden truths. It exposed corruption. It created an undeniable symbol that an individual, armed with rightful ownership and moral conviction, can challenge even the most intimidating of adversaries. And it underscored that sometimes you have to play hardball so that respect and fairness can be restored. By sunset that day, the kids were tired out but beaming with excitement. I helped them onto the dock, tying the wanderer in place. One of the little girls exclaimed, "Your boat is so cool, Mr. Olson. I want to sail again." Her enthusiasm lifted my spirit. It confirmed I'd done the right thing. Greenvale Shores wasn't just a cookie-cutter place anymore. It was a living, breathing neighborhood where people dared to question authority and stand up for each other. As I reflect on the long battle with Sabrina's HOA, a wave of gratitude washes over me. I'm grateful for Michael's unwavering support, for Linda's courage to reveal the truth, for Tiffany's legal expertise, and for all the neighbors who eventually found their voices. we transformed a toxic system into something that might genuinely serve everyone. We reminded each other that an HOA should be about collective well-being, not about picking fights or inflating property values at any cost. Still, I know new conflicts will arise because that's the nature of communities. Disagreements happen. People have different visions of how to maintain their homes, but at least now we have established guidelines that respect individuality. We have a leadership that listens before imposing any rule. We have an environment that fosters open discourse without fear. In a way, this entire fiasco strengthened our neighborhood bonds far more than any social event or meticulously manicured lawn ever could. Sometimes Sabrina's name comes up in casual conversation. I've learned not to speak of her with venom. Instead, I treat her as an example of how unchecked ambition can blind someone to the values of unity and fairness. People nod, they share their own anecdotes of petty encounters with her. We collectively shake our heads, thankful that era is over. Whenever someone asks about the fence, I simply smile and explain how it all went down. I tell them about my father's beloved boat, about the lengths I went to keep it, and how that solitary structure became the turning point in a power struggle that had run rampant. Usually the listener laughs in astonishment or admiration, especially when they learn how the fence stands as a reminder that no organization, no matter how official, can override basic rights. And so life goes on here at Greenvale Shores. The water sparkles just the same as it did before, but I think the community sparkles a bit more. Families feel freer to decorate their yards in personal ways. Older residents keep their classic cars in the drive without fearing sudden citations. The sense of belonging thrives. And the wanderer remains tied firmly to my dock, a testament to resilience and love for what my dad left behind. Nothing will ever erase the memory of that day when I first fenced off the Marina, nor will I forget the moment Sabrina realized she no longer held the upper hand. But I can't help but smile now. It's a smile born of peace and satisfaction. This place is truly home, not because it's flawless, but because I fought to protect what made it meaningful. Through that battle, I learned that standing up for my rights could also inspire a greater cause, preserving the community's spirit and ensuring neighbors look out for each other rather than turn a blind eye. As dusk settles on another tranquil evening, I step onto the dock. I run my hand over the wanderer's railing, thinking of Dad. The lake's surface gleams with the colors of the fading sun. A gentle breeze curls around me, hinting at the promise of tomorrow. I can almost hear my father's voice again. Steer with courage, trust the wind, chart your course with honor. Indeed, that's exactly what I did, and in doing so I uncovered something far greater than just safeguarding a family heirloom. I discovered a neighborhood's pulse. I found a reason to believe in collective action. I reaffirmed that individuals can indeed prevail against overreaching authority when they stand on solid ground, both literally and morally. That's the story of how one insistent HOA Karen tried to rid me of my father's boat, how I responded by fencing off the entire marina access that she and her cronies depended on, and how, in the end, we reshaped our community into something fairer and kinder. If there's a moral here, it's that justice sometimes requires bold measures. It might demand a fence, a confrontation, or a series of revelations that shake up the status quo. But as long as you're guided by truth, as long as you refuse to bow to unjust demands, you can prevail, and you might even come out stronger on the other side.